I think the Kerch Bridge is still a legitimate target that will probably be hit. Creativity, professionalism, leadership. I mean, the Ukrainian Navy has done a lot with a little. Ukraine has an inconsistent set of allies. So I think it's an opportunity to share information and probably for the United States to learn as much as the Ukrainians from each other. The Harris administration is probably going to keep it the same, which is push for the increased funding. But one of them was President Trump saying this is inappropriate. So I think all three of those things contributed so the president can take credit for that.
Let's start with the latest news regarding Russian fleet in Black Sea. So Ukrainians are saying that they sunk the Russian submarine Rostov-na-Donu. What's your take on it? What implications it might have? What consequence for Russia-Russian war in Ukraine?
In general, destroying a caliber capable, a submarine capable of launching caliber missiles is an important thing. There are only a handful of them. And the Russian Black Sea Fleet has fewer and fewer of these cruise missile capable submarines or surface ships. So from a tactical point of view, there's value in it. I think operationally it also has value because it's signaling you can't protect your bases anywhere here in the Black Sea Fleet, at least within 300-400 kilometers of Ukraine, and possibly even further. And so this is a further degradation in the long-term capacity of the Black Sea Fleet, which has had a rough 2.5 years since the beginning of the war.
What condition Russian Black Sea Fleet is right now?
So I would say this is not where they thought they'd be. I mean, certainly they didn't think they'd be fighting 27 months or 30 months later. But more importantly, they assumed, I think, that they would be able to exert sea control throughout the Black Sea. But Ukraine, which effectively has no ships now and no ship underway days, has been able to defeat Russia's ability to have sea control. And in fact, in many ways has inflicted significant damage on the Black Sea Fleet and preserved their own ability to operate commercial shipping in the Black Sea. So I think overall this has been an extremely negative experience for the Russian Navy and specifically for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And one of the things I'll say is they had thought that they could conduct amphibious demonstrations or even amphibious assaults, into Ukraine and therefore create a problem for the Ukrainian army in the sense that it would have to split its forces farther and farther. They're not able to do that. So the Ukrainian Navy has contributed a lot to the success of the Ukrainian army by removing the opportunity for an amphibious assault.
When the counteroffensive of 2023 that Ukrainian forces tried to make didn't achieve its goals as it was probably promised or expected, one of the biggest achievements for Ukrainian armed forces have been the maritime, success, right? So why do you think it happened?
Well, first I want to acknowledge, you're right, the Ukrainian Navy has had probably greater success than any service, but let's be clear, the Ukrainian Army has been fighting a much harder job, a significant, the strategic center of gravity has been on these ground campaigns. So what I would say, so I want to acknowledge that, but then say, why has the Ukrainian Navy been successful? It's a very good question, and I think it's innovation, creativity, leadership. I mean, when you have, by traditional measures, there's nothing, you better go find something. So first they used the Neptune missiles well, hit the Moskva. They got great support from NATO and the United States with a MacGyvered harpoon system, which is, to say a launcher, missiles, a communication system kind of cobbled together from different countries. But that's also had success striking Russian supply ships and smaller ships. So first they had the anti-ship cruise missile success, and that was followed very rapidly by the use of surface drones. And these surface drones have done impressive work at really great distances. And this is they've opened up a new chapter in how maritime warfare is conducted, particularly in the littorals, close to land. So creativity, professionalism, leadership. I mean, the Ukrainian Navy has done a lot with a little, and it's certainly put a Black Sea fleet, a Russian Black Sea fleet that thought they were the kings of the mountain in a bad place over the last 30 months.
During Mariupol siege, we saw that the city was targeted from, Azov Sea as well, a lot. If Russian fleet is not as capable right now as it was at the beginning of the full-scale war, will it be easier for Ukraine to, fight back the occupied Crimea and, Mariupol, other lands close to the Black Sea or Azov Sea?
So that's a great point. I do not think the Black Sea Fleet today could conduct the kind of offshore gunfire support that they did in the Mariupol campaign, nor can they provide cruise missile support from a reasonable range. So the answer is that the Russian Navy will not contribute as significantly to protect against a future Ukrainian ground, land-based counteroffensive. So that's important. I will say, though, that there's a limit to what the Ukrainian Navy can't provide, at least from my perspective, is they couldn't provide their own gunfire support and maritime, power projection from the sea ashore. They haven't shown that kind of system yet. Doesn't mean they won't invent one. They've done a fantastic job to date. But right now, this is really this is a defensive capability that that imposes pain on the Russian Navy, but not in a way that I think can translate into the Russian ground forces yet. That doesn't mean they won't invent that or think it or inspire it over the next 6 months as you think about a counteroffensive in 2025. But right now, this is still preventing Russia from doing things at sea.
Kirill Budanov, Ukrainian chief of Ukrainian intelligence, said that Crimean Bridge is one of the main targets for Ukraine right now. Do you think it's a really tough target? Like, what will it take to take it down?
So first, the Kerch Bridge, I think, is there's a strategic value to it. It's it is a symbol of Russia's imposition of its will on Crimea. But there's also a tactical value to it. There is still some logistics. I will say that there's also a ferry service that's as important or more important to logistics. So from my point of view, they have to hit both. I think it's a legitimate military target. As they have the weapons that they need to strike it, they should. They probably have to weigh that versus where else they could use that weapon, because there's limited numbers of really long-range strike kind of unitary warhead ATACMS or other systems. So within that balance, I think the Kerch Bridge is still a legitimate target that will probably be hit. But I'd also say, they've got to do something about the ferries as well. But, those surface drones might be able to do something with that too. So I think it's a 1-2 punch. But knocking down the logistics capability of Russia into Crimea is going to be important in a future counteroffensive to recapture Crimea, if one were to take place.
If you could explain why bridges are such a hard target, because previously when Kherson was occupied, Ukrainian forces really struggled to cut this bridge that was functioning as the main logistics artery.
Well, a few factors here. One, because it's a fixed position, it's easier to attack, but also what the enemy is trying to hit, so it's easier. If you have limited defense forces, sometimes it's easier to know what the adversary is going at. So the Russians suspect that the Ukrainians are going to attack the bridge. The Russians can concentrate their air defense systems around it. Now look, you would have thought they were doing that around their Black Sea ports and their naval command headquarters, yet they've still been hit. So just having defensive systems is not a guarantee of protection. So I think they will be able to hit it. I think it's hard to hit because it's well defended. But in the end, they can and will hit it. And I think if there were to be a counteroffensive, I think you can count on the bridge being hit multiple times as part of that. Now, it is a complex bridge that has multiple rail and road surfaces on it. So, it takes, it's probably more than one hit in one spot to do the damage that's necessary. But I do expect it's a legitimate wartime target and it'll continue to be hit.
Would mind, let's talk about Ukrainian grain corridor. So Ukraine achieved that. Do you think Russia will try to undermine it, those efforts, those ships that are being, transporting Ukrainian grain right now?
I have no hesitation saying that that Russia would very willingly attack the grain corridors, which would induce famine in Africa without a second thought. I harbor no illusions about the kind of methodical, evil intent of Vladimir Putin and his henchmen. Now, having said that, they're having a lot of trouble doing this. One, Ukraine has been able to force the Russians away from Ukrainian waters so that the grain shipments can get underway and then eventually enter the territorial waters of Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and then out into the Mediterranean. So they're able to establish that condition. Could Russia still take risk and try to hit it? Yes. But then Ukraine did the other thing last year, which was strike was do some operations against Russian merchant shipping. And so that kind of deterrent effect. So on the one hand, they've created deterrence by denial, by creating a path for their grain shipments to flow out. And second, they've the deterrence by cost imposition, by imposing costs on the Russians. So the Russians know that should they attack, take a risk and attack the Ukrainian systems, the Ukrainian merchants, the Ukrainians may do the same to the Russians.
So in our interview in July, General Corcoran said that you're an expert not just in the maritime domain, but also in joint force operations. What do you think Ukrainian armed forces are lacking in terms of combining those different branches of, army, fleet, and air force?
Well, as I go back now, I think, I was at U.S. European Command for a number of years, creating training environments for our Eastern European allies and partners like Ukraine. And if I go back now, I think we were very tactically focused, and we built training areas near Lviv and others where platoon and company level training occurred routinely. We worked with the Ukrainian Navy and the Ukrainian Air Force, and our California Air National Guard did lots of pilot-to-pilot training. We probably did not do a good job post-2014 in kind of thinking about the operational level of war. And that left, I think, the Ukrainians to, kind of traditional concepts that they had, left over from Soviet times, but also, trying to learn from us, but not, with individual personnel going to like the Army War College or the Naval War College or National Defense University here in the United States. We did not, in hindsight, the United States didn't provide that kind of operational level insights that are necessary. To get to the position I was at as the head of operations in the Pacific, for all our joint forces, was 30 years of preparation, working in joint environments, working in Navy or joint environments over 30 years with 20 years of operations. So there was a system built around people like me or General Corcoran or General Hodges as we developed our skill sets. That just didn't exist for the Ukrainian general officers and their colonels and lieutenant colonels to the same degree, and then we didn't provide it after 2014. So I do think there's an opportunity now for the Ukrainians to learn those skill sets, develop them, integrate in the fantastic tactics and operational level stuff that they've developed in this 2.5 years of conflict. I can't say enough about how much innovation I've seen in the war space. We talked about the maritime earlier, but you also see it in ground combat and in air combat. And so I'm confident that given all the proper tools, the spirit and the will of the Ukrainian army or military is going to come through. But last year I think we saw the kind of unintended consequences of the United States and its NATO partners not providing that kind of operational level support between 2014 and 2021, when it would have been, easier to provide in a less frenetic atmosphere.
Why do you think this cooperation slowed down?
Well, I just think we thought at the tactical level, and it's true if you were to look at, we trained forces generally to go to Afghanistan in other Eastern European countries. So if you went to Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, we were providing company level special forces training, platoon level special forces training. If you went to Because Poland provided larger units and Georgia provided larger units, we tended to get up to the battalion or even brigade level in Poland for our training. But that's because they were providing these large-scale units for employment in Afghanistan or Iraq. But so generally what we provided was company and platoon level, and so that's what Ukraine saw. Or in the case of the Air Force, like F-16 pilot-to-pilot training, or in the Navy, some minesweeping training, things like that. We really didn't get focused on like the larger operational level of war, and it wasn't something you would naturally do. It was, in hindsight, it was a mistake, but at the time, I think it appeared to us that we were probably making the right investments.
Also, you've just mentioned the demining efforts. How do you think? How big do you think this problem will be in the Black Sea after, the war or after some peace agreement? So
look, I think, first of all, I think the Russians have a poor track record from Afghanistan and other places we know in terms of properly tracking their unexploded ordnance and dealing with it before they leave. And as bad as the issue may be at sea, I think it's going to be nothing compared to the unexploded ordnance problem in eastern Ukraine. The Russians have the Russians are very willing to use weapons with a high dud rate, failure to detonate rate. And this is particularly problematic when you're applying it to distributed weapons with small little rockets and bomblets in it. And so I think there's going to be a lot of these spread throughout Ukraine, and there's going to be a significant demining effort on the land. Out at sea, there could be some floating mines that will be an issue, or poorly charted minefields that have to be depopulated over time. And as bad as that is, I think it pales into comparison for the problem we're going to see. And the weapons I'm talking about are referred to as cluster munitions. And I just think the allowable dud rate on Russian cluster munitions is exceptionally high. So there's many unexploded cluster munitions spread throughout the battlefield, and which children or farmers can come in contact with, with deadly results. So we're going to have a big problem when the war is over.
You just returned from Taiwan, right? Do you feel that China is learning lessons from Russian full-scale aggression in Ukraine, or do you feel that Taiwan is preparing to defend itself, or do you feel that the United States is doing enough to help them prepare?
So there's a lot in those questions. First, what I'll say is China learning from Russia? Yes. I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned about how strong is your logistics. Most of us thought, if you'd asked me in, January of 2022, does Russia have a large-scale maneuver army? I would have said yes. By all indications they do. The limited studying of Zapad and other exercises would have said yes. The reality was no. So I think that the Chinese are watching that and saying we better understand our logistics a little better, to the degree that we're relying on the Russians for that, technologically or doctrine-wise, we better study it. I think they've also learned a lot about electronic warfare and jamming, and they'll be incorporating that better into their warfighting. And certainly everyone's learned a lot about drones. Although I will say this is drones in a battlefield that has no air power, which is a little different than the battlefield the United States tends to set, or the battlefield that China would like to set over Taiwan. But still, there's a lot to be learned about drones. So yes, the Chinese have learned a lot. Have the Taiwans learned a lot? Yes, equally. They've learned a lot about you can, as a smaller power, fighting a counter-interventionist war against a larger power, be successful. And for the United States, and so those have been, that has to do with, they're looking at mine warfare more, both at land and on sea. They're looking at drones, anti-armor, things like javelins, anti-air defense, particularly the man-portable air defense systems. And so they're procuring a lot of these new systems to make sure that they're a tougher nut to crack for China. I think the United States has learned a lot as well. First of all, the munitions problem that plagued us in March of 2022, where we could not rapidly provide the Javelin, Stingers, 155 artillery ammunition. to our Ukrainian partners without going deep into our own stores. The same problem existed with the China-specific weapon systems. And in fact, in that way, the war in Ukraine has actually been a good thing in terms of preparing for the war with China, because we're starting to solve the munitions problem for China, something we've never addressed in 10 or 15 years of supposedly working on the problem. So we're in a much better position there.
So the way you were speaking about this, do you feel that this war is inevitable?
I think that eventually China will take action to try to coerce Taiwan. Now, that does not necessarily mean it's a cross-strait invasion or a blockade. It could be a financial coercion campaign, or a financial coercion campaign layered in with a cyber malicious attack campaign, layered in with some military operations like what we call virtual quarantine, where you stop some ships, do missile closure areas. But if you do that kind of economic coercion enabled by cyber attacks with a little bit of military posturing, that could add up to enough pressure on Taiwan, if the United States doesn't step in as a good ally and partner to support them, to bend to China's will. So while I'm not sure there'll be a kinetic war, I am confident eventually Chairman Xi, before he leaves office, will attempt to coerce Taiwan into a more strict adherence to the one country, two systems model.
Well, as you mentioned, cyber attacks is something that Russia has been extensively using in Ukraine before the full-scale military invasion, right? Do you think that the situation in Taiwan, in China, as well as conflicts on the Middle East, this growing conflict, can draw attention back from Ukraine and make people forget that Ukraine is still fighting this huge power and that the intensity of the war is not going down?
So look, obviously I am concerned that saying that it's okay to say our top priority is preparing for a conflict with China. It's not okay to say our only priority is preparing for a conflict with China. We should be able to prepare for a conflict with China and still provide resources to Ukraine. Remember, our commitment to Ukraine is not blood and treasure, it's treasure. We're not committing U.S. forces, we're not lowering our readiness, we're not making our troops deploy to dwell, which is how long they're forward on the point. We're not impacting that at all. Instead, we're giving money. And let's be clear how much money we've given. If you look at the total amount of security assistance to date, and look at since February of 2022, and compare it to the amount we've spent on the Department of Defense, just the Department of Defense budget since 2022, it's less than 2.5% is our contribution to Ukraine. So for 2.5% of our Department of Defense budget, we've been able to help an ally inflict significant degradations onto the Russian military. Russia has lost 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 armored vehicles, 300 plus attack aircraft and rotary wing aircraft, 300,000 troops, severely injured or killed or lost on the battlefield. These are phenomenal numbers by the Ukrainian military, imposed by the Ukrainian military, with the support of only 2.5% of our defense budget. One of our two principal adversaries is really limited in its ability to conduct offensive conventional operations against the rest of NATO because of Ukraine's strength. So to me, you should be able to focus the majority of your $900 billion defense budget on countering China and still dealing with small operational problems in the Middle East and elsewhere, and still give 40 to 60 billion in security assistance to the Ukrainian government every year. That is an absolutely doable task for us. And at this point, it doesn't matter. If you didn't like giving the support to Ukraine in 2022, you can make an argument for that. But now in 2024, you can't withdraw it. The signal, the worst signal that we can do is support Ukraine till it gets uncomfortable and then step back and stop. The signal to China is we're a weak ally. We're an unreliable partner, and that therefore they can press forward in Taiwan. They already believe that coming with our kind of unfortunate withdrawal from Afghanistan that was extremely chaotic, poorly planned, and really done at the wrong time, done too early. If you amplify that with a bad decision and leave Ukraine, then you've really sent the message to China of how not credible our assurances to Taiwan are. And therefore, deterrence will fail in Asia.
For as long as it takes, this is the phrase that we hear from the White House officials of different levels. Do you think that the administration, the current one or the future one, someone in America who will be, making decisions, be in charge, do they have the clear vision of Ukraine's victory, or there is no clear understanding of what's going to happen?
I don't think either the current president or either of the two candidates has a clear vision of victory for Ukraine, and that's unfortunate. From my point of view, again, as I mentioned earlier, to back out now is the worst of all decisions because it harms your credibility as a superpower worldwide. But more than that, you do need, it's incumbent on whoever's president to provide the security assistance that's been authorized and to allow the Ukrainians to use the weapons in a way that maximizes their effectiveness, imposes cost on Russia, and prevents Russia from doing further damage to Ukraine, and eventually creates the condition for Ukraine to regain its sovereign territory that was illegally annexed or taken by the Russians either in 2014 or 2022. To do that requires a contest of wills between Ukraine, Russia, and the West. And look, we're sacrificing the least, the West. It's just money. They're sacrificing blood in Ukraine, and from the Russian point of view, they are as well. We need to continue to keep the pressure on Russia until domestic issues in Russia force Vladimir Putin to re-examine this. And I think some of the elements that we're starting to see will get us there. Their draft is going to have to start hitting more and more ethnic Russians, ethnic Slavs. And I think that's going to be a problem for Vladimir Putin going forward. He's going to have a problem with the mothers of the children, of the young boys who are drafted into the Russian military now that he's out of prisoners. And that is going to have an impact, I think, on Russian domestic politics and eventually on Putin. That's the kind of point we need to get to, where he has strategic dilemmas. He's not just giving strategic dilemmas to to Ukraine or NATO or the United States, but he's experiencing those dilemmas himself and has to make the hard decisions.
General Corcoran said that they would love to include you into their next trip to Ukraine to meet with Ukrainian generals, Ukrainian commanders of different branches. What message, if or when you go, would you have to them? What do you feel they should do differently to avoid what is happening right now on the front line?
Well, first, if you think that I mostly do maritime things, I'd be interested, if I were there, I'd be interested in learning from the Ukrainians how they develop these tactics, what they're thinking about how to expand them to continue to impose their will against the Black Sea Fleet. It's extremely impressive, something I would have never expected. I think the Navy that had the most successful year in 2023 over the last year was a Navy with no ships, effectively. That's pretty impressive. And so I'd like to learn from them. I'm confident there's a few things about how you bring together sensors and shooters, systems that spot the target and systems that apply, power against the target that maybe the United States still understands, a little better. But, we have to be cautious in the United States to telling the Ukrainians how to do things when they've been in combat for the last 2.5 years. So I think it's an opportunity to share information and probably for the United States to learn as much as the Ukrainians from each other.
Well, but still Ukraine is not winning so far, and Russian troops are moving forward.
So Ukraine is fighting a country whose GDP is, tenfold, whose number of citizens is sevenfold, just enormous numbers. I think Ukraine is doing very well. And Ukraine has a inconsistent set of allies. The United States took a 6-month pause in, providing assistance, which probably is about a 4.5-month pause in presidential drawdown authority weapons and Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative procurement. Those hurt. And by the way, they'll continue to hurt. You know, so the decision not to provide money in the fall of last year and the early spring of this year, part of that will reflect 12 and 24 months later on delayed procurement. So we haven't seen the total impact of that yet. So, you know, the United States has to do a more consistent job of supporting Ukraine in its assistance, as does NATO. And I'm disappointed that NATO, I'm excited that NATO agreed another $43 billion in assistance. I'm disappointed that they didn't agree to multi-year assistance, as the Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, had asked for. Instead, he got a one-year agreement, and that's, to me, that's unfortunate. But overall, you know, we are still providing a lot of assistance between the United States and NATO.
The fact that NATO is taking lead on supporting Ukraine and establishing this Joint Force Command in Germany, do you think that will help to be more consistent?
I think that the United States is doing a very good job with that. And our Assistant Secretary of Defense, Celeste Wallander, has done a very strong job in administering that program and coordinating, you know, very disparate donations and financial versus equipment support, and, you know, making it easier for facilitating those kind of transfers. And the U.S. European Command is, you know, at a tactical operational level, has done a great job with that. So NATO stepping in, I think you'll probably see a dual system where the U.S. component is as large as it's always been. Then you have an equal-sized NATO component for some 4, 5, 6 months, and then eventually a transition over of responsibility. Hopefully we'll do this in a very smooth way that is transparent to the Ukrainian recipients. But, you know, I think it's appropriate for NATO to run that. I think the United States ran it because we're more agile. And, you know, in late February of 2022 or March of 2022, you know, you need to do something really fast, and your choice is U.S. European Command or NATO. I'd always take U.S. European Command and the U.S. Office of Secretary of Defense. And they were very efficient and very quick. And NATO can be agile once the system, you know, once the train is running at 30 miles an hour, NATO can keep it running at 30 miles an hour, maybe even speed it up a little bit. But NATO's not very good at getting the train going from 0 to 30. That's where European Command is. I've always felt that way when I thought about writing war plans when I was at U.S. European Command. And I was a new admiral at the time. You're writing war plans, I always felt that the U.S. European Command war plan, which was kind of a coalition of the willing, was always going to be the start point for a conflict with Russia. And maybe the NATO plan would be the end point. But, you know, I think that's always a good way to think that, you know, that kind of agility only comes from a U.S. combatant command.
How do you see Ukraine support from the United States changing or not changing after the elections?
I mean, that's hard to say. I think a Harris administration is probably going to keep it the same, which is push for the increased funding, still be a little, you know, too slow on providing weapons, you know, full weapons release capabilities so that the Ukrainians can use the weapons the United States give them at their maximum ranges against targets inside Russia. They've always been slow. They were slow with the, you know, Gimlers, guided missile launcher rocket system. They were slow with the TACMs. They were slow with the M1A1s. They were the tanks. They were slow with the F-16s. You know, so I think, you know, you'll have some good and some bad there. With President Trump, it's much harder to understand. I mean, I think he says things like the Europeans have to do this themselves. And what I would say to President Trump is, you know, when you said this in 2017, 2018, you know, the number of NATO countries that spent, you know, 2% on defense was 5 or 6. Now it's 23 or 24, depending on how you count it. That's to your credit. I mean, a lot of things drove that. One of them was certainly Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Another was NATO Secretary General. But one of them was President Trump saying this is inappropriate. So I think all three of those things contributed so the president can take credit for that. Usually when President Trump can take credit for something, he'll keep doing it. So I hope that as he recognizes that the stronger position we're in today is in part a reflection of, you know, his pushing Europe, you know, 6, 7 years ago, maybe he'll continue, he'll do the right thing and continue the support. We'll have to see, though. I think the United States, one thing I would say is the United States has to remind itself just the level of sacrifice of Ukraine. Their economy has been shattered. Their critical infrastructure is attacked nightly. They've lost tens of thousands of troops. This is for a small, a country that's the size of, much smaller than California, or, in terms of population and GDP. This is a big sacrifice. And we're being asked for a very small sacrifice of treasure. I think it's extremely reasonable that both for our own national security interests, but also because it's the right thing to do, to continue that support and recognize the degree to which Ukraine has borne the brunt of Russian authoritarianism, since 2014, but more specifically since 2022, and that continued assistance is in our best interest.